So thank you for coming today. I know there's quite a good few of the decent talks on, so thanks for coming to see my talk on the Android security jungle. I've tried to use, hopefully it's not too contrived for you guys, but I've tried to use the jungle as an analogy to the kind of the ecosystem and kind of like talk about some of the threats and risks to sort of, on Android. I've kind of made quite a few little references to a well-known jungle movie. If you don't know what it is, hopefully it won't put you off too much. And hopefully I also want to sort of dispel a few myths and stuff around Android security. So the first part is really open, hopefully for everyone, of sort of all abilities. And the second part, we kind of jump into some sort of like survival tips, things we can do to make our apps more stronger. So this is more geared towards Android developers. So if I could just get like a show of hands, who's an Android developer, just so I know which part to spend more time on. Okay, cool. So a couple of people. So we'll spend more time on the sort of ecosystem stuff then. So let me just kind of introduce myself in a bit more kind of detail, so you know who this guy is at the front. I work for a company, an apps company in Bath called Interhand, and we sort of make apps like weather apps, retail apps. We're kind of guns for hire. People come to us for their app ideas, and so we make them. And we make kind of different apps. So network quality of service was the kind of the last app that I worked on, and the bit that I like is the security kind of side, and that kind of interest led me to co-author the Android Security Cookbook at the end of sort of 2013, and I wrote about a third of that book focused on sort of app defense and sort of hardening. So kind of the other rest of the book was written by like a pen tester. So the idea is you have like someone attacking, exploiting, and then the next chapter that I wrote was on sort of defending. So it's quite a sort of good mix. And the other thing is, Sam mentioned, I co-founded SW Mobile in 2011, which is a meetup group very similar to Bristech, run for developers, by developers effectively, but with a more kind of mobile kind of focus. But it's the same sort of thing. So that's kind of me in 3 bullet points that might be interesting. To sort of set the scene around Android. We heard from Sundar, the CEO of Google, a couple of weeks ago at the Nexus launch event that Android now has 1.4 billion 30-day active users. So that means devices with Google services that are kind of active in that time. So the number must be higher than that, because there's lots of things like the Amazon Kindle, the Kindle Fire, and lots of Chinese kind of OEMs don't have aren't official kind of versions of Android, so that number must be higher. So it's a huge number of users, and what I'm trying to illustrate with this kind of fun graphic is that it's a diverse kind of ecosystem. For any of you who have seen the OpenSignals.com's like yearly kind of fragmentation report, which this kind of graphic is stolen from. There are thousands of different devices and hundreds of OEMs, and it's a diverse ecosystem. And certainly, in this kind of ecosystem, there's this differentiation and things, but they're not reliant on one single like company or entity, and so that's not like that's a good thing that it's not reliant on that. But the main point I'm trying to make is that there's no absolute one way that it is, and you should be really skeptical of any developers or security people that tell you this is the way it is on Android. But so when we're like iOS has unlike iOS, Android doesn't have this easy option of updating Android versions on all this diversity, all this range of devices, because OEMs and carriers make modifications. So how does Google kind of cope with that? How does Google update security push out security updates when there's kind of so much diversity? Well, one of the things they do is employ various different security services to sort of help with this. And I've just picked out a couple to sort of highlight to you today. The Google Play Store, for those that even without Android phones will kind of have heard of that. You know, it's the App Store. There's been a human involved in the app approval process since the beginning of 2005. And it still only takes between 3 and 24 hours to get your updates live, which is pretty good in my opinion. And so there's this approval process. There's also sort of developer account approvals and sort of account validation and background checks. Kind of Google leverage the fact that they have their other apps like Gmail and all the rest of it, all these other data points to sort of help validate accounts and detect potentially fraudulent Google accounts. They've also started a sort of security notification program for registered developers. And so when they're doing this kind of scanning of your apps, and if they detect things like you're using like a vulnerable version of OpenSSL, if you've accidentally left your private keys in the app, and they've also done it for some specific version. There was some specific exploits with Cordova, PhoneGap, if you guys are familiar with that at all. So they would sort of send those notifications out to developers, so hey, we detected this in your app, please update it. And they reckon about 60,000 apps have been updated on the sort of back of that program. So it's continuing to sort of grow all the time. And the other thing related to the Google Play Store is the Android Bouncer service, which was announced several years ago. And it's kind of something that runs in the background, trawls through all the APKs that are on the Play Store, runs them in like an emulated environment, and checks for exploits and malware and things like that. And if necessary, it will suspend those apps, or it can remotely wipe them from devices. The other thing you should look at, certainly if you've got an Android device and you haven't installed this, I'd certainly recommend it, is the Android Device Manager. And this is device security, and this is like a service similar to the Find My iPhone service, if you're familiar with that. Allows you to find, lock, and if necessary, wipe your device. And it's a free service, so I'd sort of recommend using that. The other thing that has kind of been fairly recently kind of announced by Google is the safety net service. And what safety net does, it's kind of like an intrusion detection service. So all the devices that have Google services installed upload sort of anonymous kind of data about the device, network that it's on, and things like that. And they sort of crunch all this data and look for potential malware and threats. And I'll talk about in the second part. There's a kind of like public API for SafetyNet, which you can call to sort of do some device integrity checks. But yeah, I'll mention that in section 2. But yeah, that's just some of the services that Google can update more regularly and sort of are in place to sort of help improve security, in addition to over-the-air updates. But what are some of the threats? I think we've all seen those kind of media headlines about Android security, and it kind of winds me up a bit. They're all very clickbaity, but certainly there has been more publicly disclosed malware, in the Android ecosystem than competitors like iOS. Largely, the malware has been sort of premium SMS driven. And although like in Android 4.2 there's like a user confirmation if you're texting a short code like a premium SMS code, you get like a user pop-up confirmation. That has helped mitigate some of that type of malware. But you still get things like information stealers, and there has been some recent cases of sort of ransomware. But the point I want to make about kind of malware and stuff is that regions play like a massive role in sort of malware prevalence. So like Russia, China, and sort of the Persian region they sort of drag everyone else's the average up sort of thing. So if you're in Europe and sort of North America, there's extremely low instances of malware. And a lot of times with these kind of threats, it's like the sensible things you do, like with your computer. If you're downloading dodgy software, keygens and cracks on your Windows PC, then you're more at risk for getting viruses and malware. It's the same principle applies to your Android device. The other kind of threat we have to worry about is something called app hijacking, and this is more if you've got an application in the store, or your company has. And this is also known as Trojanizing your app, or Trojanizing apps. And it's basically taking a genuine app from the Play Store or alternate store, decompiling it, and then adding some malicious code. And the concerns around this are really based on the fact that reverse engineering Android apps is easy if you don't put any kind of protection in place. We'll cover a bit of that later. There's no certificate authority for apps. So part of their security, one of the cornerstones of sort of Android security, I guess, is that each app, before you can install it on another device, you need to sign it with a developer certificate. But with Android, that developer certificate is self-signed, so you don't have to get that from any kind of central authority. So anyone can sort of decompile an app and then sign it with their own key. It's not as bad as I can't sort of take Facebook's app, put some malware in it, and then sign it, and then dupe you guys into installing it. The signatures have to be the same. So there's still some security. But if you were one person in the world that hasn't got Facebook, then I could potentially Trojanize that. And the other kind of concern around this is that sideloading apps, and that's where you kind of install an app from not from the official Play Store, is a lot easier in Android. It's turning off a box, checking a box in your settings, rather than like an iOS having to sort of jailbreak the device. So this is the kind of like issues around around app hijacking. The other kind of security concerns and stories in the sort of ecosystem in the last kind of 18 months. In fact, I could probably do a talk just on security incidents that have happened over the last 18 months. There's been so many. Heartbleed was a big issue, even though it only affected sort of there was only one version of Android that was really vulnerable. It's still if anyone included those specific affected libraries in their apps, that they would be affected. And more recently, stage fright. And as you can see, you need to have a cool logo and a cool name if you're going to have come out with an exploit. And the media love this, and that's what kind of builds the hype. And actually, stage fright, on paper, it's huge. It affects almost every single Android device in the market. But actually, what are you at risk from? It's not a massive danger. Denial of a service attack on the device, that's nasty. But actually, making that into a viable thing where you can exploit someone's data or device, we haven't seen anything yet, as far as I know. I wanted to mention stage fright because it had a really positive result because it got so much attention. Google kind of announced for Nexus devices, and that, for those who aren't familiar, Nexus devices are the kind of like Google's kind of brand devices. They'll get like monthly security updates, so that's kind of a massive thing. And also, Samsung and LG have also kind of stepped up and are offering now more frequent security updates. So I think it was an excellent piece of research. And it was great to highlight it, and I think there's some really positive things that come out of that. No presentation today, hopefully. We'll be complete without a top 10. We have to have this in every presentation. It's like the rules. And this presentation is no exception. So I wanted to cover just, that's some of the threats we talked about. But, when we're creating apps for the platform, what are the risks for those apps? And fortunately, there's a top 10 by kind of a non-profit organisation you might have heard of, the Open Web Application Security Project. So it's a not-for-profit organisation focused on building more secure software. And a couple of years ago, they came out with a mobile security project with top 10 sort of risks, and they've been updating it since, and actually it's due an update around this time of year. And then I've got the list here mainly for your reference for people looking at it after the talk. Way too much for one slide. But I just wanted to sort of make the point there. And for each of these kind of risks, they have the the attack vectors and sort of the what data could be compromised. And in some cases, they have sample code and stuff on how to sort of mitigate those. So yeah, it's certainly worth checking that out. And one of the things we do at Interhand is that we use this list as our sort of checklist for apps when we're sort of developing them, and in terms of quality assurance and things, to try and sort of make sure that in specification time and in development and throughout the whole process that we're sort of mindful of these things. So that was the kind of risks and hopefully the kind of main takeaway I think from the first kind of section is that there's a lot of diversity in Android, and and there's threats out there, but we know there's a top 10 of risks. So in this kind of jungle, what can we do to add to our survival kit to really kind of beef up the security in our apps? So we're going to dive a bit deeper now, and I was wanting to cover these kind of 5 kind of areas, and in each area we'll do it like a couple of tips, but network communications, from the app to the server, storing data, and really I'm talking about encryption there. Next we'll look at kind of validating the app and then validating the device it's running on. There's a couple of things you can do to help with that. To sort of tie and wrapping all that up is increasing the binary security of your app to sort of help make it more difficult for attackers to sort of undo those other kind of bits, hardening techniques that you put in. And lastly, we'll look at some like testing and some suites that you can use to sort of as part of your development process to sort of help make sure that you're not vulnerable. Firstly, I just wanted to talk about mention about this kind of functionality. This is like undoubtedly like really kind of bad UX. People using apps they want to solve a problem or do something. They have a goal in mind. So popping up like forcing the user to update the app is really bad UX. So normally I would totally recommend not doing this. But for a security related patch or something like that, where you found a vulnerable issue with your app and you need users to sort of update, I personally think this is a warranted piece of functionality. So that's something you might want to consider as a first step in with your apps. And it's very easy to put these in. There's libraries on GitHub that check the Play Store automatically for particular versions. You can check a text file on your server or something like that. But yeah, I'd recommend this kind of functionality. Not for some new feature or some bug fixes, specifically for critical your user data is at risk type updates. So let's talk about network communication. So I wanted to sort of start off with this first, really, because I don't think I've built an app without some form of internet connection. And so the first and foremost is use Ssl and Tls, and I feel a bit kind of silly saying that really, but you should use SSL for all your connections, all your API calls, and all your calls. Like if you're loading content in a web view, load them from using TLS. And also I would recommend only you can. There's settings within the SDK, and you can sort of restrict to only use the higher Cipher suites. You don't have to worry about too much detail of of the inner workings of SSL, but the sort of short version is, in general, you can downgrade the security because it has to support older browsers, and that's kind of what the technology was originally designed for. But if you control the server and you control the app, you can what's the word? Restrict that connection and enforce is the word I was looking for. Sorry. Enforce that connection to use the higher Cipher suites. So you can do that very easily in OKHTTP if anyone's using that. It's pretty much a one-liner in that library, and there's an article on how to do it there. In fact, actually, if you're using OKHTTP, and I totally recommend it, version 2.1 came with a shed load of security updates, so I definitely recommend using that. And so, yeah, you can enforce only to use the higher versions. The other thing you can totally do this without OKHTTP. It's just a few more extra lines of code. And if anyone wants code samples on that of this, just give me a shout afterwards. I can email you, or go to Stack Overflow. The other thing you can do to sort of harden the connection is use something called Ssl Pinning. Just get a show of hands. Anyone's heard of Ssl Pinning? Okay, a couple of people. So just for those who aren't familiar, it's kind of a way of reducing your risk of man-in-the-middle attack, and that's where someone is sitting between you effectively and the internet. One of the kind of reasons for this is because each of our devices come with over 100 certificate authorities installed on them. And if one of those is compromised, and it has happened in the last 5 years, two have been compromised, and also in light of the Edward Snowden sort of allegations and some of the kind of information he released, there's some grey areas about what government agencies have, various CAs in their pockets to be able to sort of sign certificates. And so the idea is, so with the way the trust thing works, so if you have a compromised certificate, all users can install their own. It just means that even though that you're using SSL, it means someone can basically could intercept that, and so your app is talking encrypted to your man-in-the-middle attacker, and that's been encrypted, decrypted, so they can read it and then re-encrypt it back up to your server. So that's a man-in-the-middle attack effectively. And what pinning tries to do is to limit the scope of that and limit the trust. So you can pin to your specific certificate or your certificate authority. And there are basically two ways of doing it. And when we're talking about pinning, what we're doing, we're talking about when we make the connection in our code, in our app, when we make that connection, we get the SSL certificate chain as part of the connection. You can get hold of it. And you just validate that. You're just checking some things that in build time that are going to be, so what certificate you're using or should be using. So you can pin the whole certificate and verify that way. Or what you can do is you can extract the public key from the certificate and just check the public keys. And it's really just one of those things where something at build time and you're just checking at runtime. It's quite simple. I definitely would recommend public key pinning because this way you're not forced to update your app when you have like an SSL certificate renewal. It's fractionally more work to do because you have to take you have to extract the public key. But that's really simple. I've put this little thumbnail when I've got sort of full code samples and stuff in the book. But actually, I've got some open source utilities that will pull a public key out of a certificate. You just give it a URL. It's really simple. The other thing you could look at doing in terms of, or the last thing in terms of network, is to Google Play services in. I think it was 7.5, maybe earlier. They started providing this dynamic security provider, and this is basically a way that apps can call and update the Ssl libraries on the device. So this was kind of in light of like the go-to fail Ssl bug and thing. Even though that didn't really affect Android so much as it did iOS. Things like that, and Poodle and other kind of greatly named exploits. There's a quick code sample there, really good training article about it on the Android developer at android.com. But yeah, so that will kind of update the encryption and the the Ssl libraries and stuff on the device. And there's like an asynchronous way of calling it. I say details are all in that article. This is pretty cool as well. We'll talk about encryption next, but if you are, you can also use, it's not just for your ensuring the SSL, there's no flaws in that. You can also use that for crypto as well, and it's a more up-to-date version than the platform. So you don't have to worry about if you're running on, Android 4.1 or 5 or 6. You can use this provider installer to make sure you've got the most up-to-date crypto provider, which is pretty cool. The other alternative for crypto is that you bundle your own in the app. But this is you don't have to do that with this way. So let's move to data storage. So when I'm talking about data storage, I mean encrypting it. I have to include this graphic in every presentation I do. I should have worn a t-shirt. What used to something used to sort of annoy me when I had pen test results back for apps I've developed or talked to security people was that the default kind of response about sort of storing data was, just don't store it in your app. If you want something secure, don't store it. And sort of to me as an apps developer, I want to make my app as performant as possible. I want to make it work offline. I want to make it work with sort of dodgy mobile connections. And the whole idea of not storing that data really kind of felt like a cop-out to me. So I think you can still store sensitive information, but you have to encrypt it. Of course, the caveat with this is it depends on the type of data. Medical records, probably not. Nuclear launch codes, probably shouldn't be writing an app for that. But that kind of idea. So it's certainly something you should approach early on in the project and in the app. You can rate the risk of the data. And so if you're storing it, encrypt it basically. And I want to show just show a bit of code to show you how easy it is to create it in the best way. So encryption, generally you don't have to worry about the sort of details and the algorithms and stuff too much, because the main issue with encryption is what to do with the key. The algorithms, it's easier just to find the key than it is to break the algorithms. So the best thing to do with the key is not store it, which is probably obvious, but and so this is a way of generating, in this case, a symmetric encryption key, which you can use for AES encryption, using a user input password. And so this is, use the app and whatever kind of user journey you take people on, but they use a passcode or a password to use the app, and then when the app is launched, from the background or for the first time, they type in that password, and that allows you to generate the key. It's called deriving the key, and use that key in memory to decrypt and encrypt. And then, when the user logs out, or when you have a timeout, you could just do it when they switch app or something. You wipe that from memory. Obviously, don't log the key, and obviously, and don't store it. That's the key thing behind it. No pun intended. The other thing to sort of just note about this is that I've used it like a more secure number of iterations. So the idea of this kind of code is that you use the password Ssl, which has to be kind of the same each time. I tend to sort of generate a new one per device and just keep that per device. And a number of iterations. And the more iterations you do, the longer it takes, but the more secure and the harder to brute force it is. I've used 10,000 there because it's a big number. It makes it more secure. But you have to sort of be wary about how long this takes, because like on a Nexus 5, 10,000 iterations takes about 3 to 4 seconds, which is significant if in terms of login and things like that. So you might want to adjust that according, again, to the risk of whatever that data is that you're storing. So there's a full code sample of this, doing it like using PBE and just generating them in a good way and using the correct algorithms and stuff in the book. I want to talk about a couple of libraries that will help you as well using encryption. These are all commercially viable. Otherwise, there's no point talking about them really, because often we're doing commercial stuff. So these are all kind of fine to use. So Conceal, and you can just Google these. I don't bother putting links in because you can just Google is your friend here. Conceal is from Facebook, and what they use it for is encrypting photos they store on the SD card. So they cache all the photos, your profile and things, but they make sure they're encrypted. It's really quick. It uses AES GCM, which is the kind of, if you're looking for algorithms to use, that's the preferred one. And it's really easy to use. Unlike if you've ever done any encryption in Java, which defaults to not the strongest algorithms, these libraries do default to stronger ones. Yeah, actually, just one talk about the SD card. If you're storing anything on the SD card, it has to be encrypted. The SD card is kind of the Wild West. Anyone can read to it, anyone can write to it. So if you're storing data on the SD card and then reading it back in, you should treat that as untrusted because anyone can do anything to it. The other one I wanted to mention was SQL Cipher. It's a kind of replication of SQLite. It basically transparently encrypts all the kind of tables and pages in the back. The back end, so you don't have to sort of worry about anything. The API is almost exactly the same as the standard SQLite in Android. The only difference is when you create a database, a new one, or you open it, you have to pass in a password, and then under the hood it does that same kind of code as I showed you over the page to sort of derive the encryption key, and then it does that seamlessly in the background. It uses 256-bit AES in CBC mode. And it's really good. And you probably see like a 5% performance decrease by using it. So it's not massive. I'd say the only kind of real negative of using it is that it adds between like 4 and 7 meg to your APK file size, which it can be a deal breaker for some people. Although Google did just announce like 2 weeks ago that the APK file size limit has been up to 100 meg. So with people getting 4G and quicker connections, you don't have to be so sensitive over APK file size anymore. But yeah, like I say, for some people it's a deal breaker. And lastly, I just wanted to talk about like shared preferences. And for those that aren't familiar with shared preferences, it's just like a way of storing arbitrary key value pairs. It's kind of backed by an XML file. And I thought I'd shout out to one of my open source libraries, Secure Preferences, or a much more popular and better named one, Hawk, does the same kind of thing. It just allows you, it just wraps the standard shared preferences if you've used them in your app, and just encrypts them. So if anyone has a rooted device and anyone's kind of looking for that stuff in your app's private sandbox, it will be nonsense to them. So with secure preferences, you can use it with a password, and it uses that code. In fact, that same code as we saw over the page. But also, if you don't supply a password, it will generate one. And so it's just when you're generating one, it's obviously not secure because we're storing the key in there as well. So it's a way of kind of just obfuscating them. So no one can go and change change the settings of your app, like say a login timeout or a pin code or something like that, without a lot more work in reverse engineering and sort of working out how the algorithms generate and things like that. The last thing I just wanted to say on encryption was don't hard code the key. And this is the equivalent of locking your front door and leaving the keys in the lock. Wicked, your house is locked. But obviously there's no security at all there, and it's the same with hard-coding encryption keys. There's no point in using encryption if you're going to put the keys in the app. They're extremely easy to decompile and take out. So, and plus also once one person has done that, then all the app data is at risk. If you absolutely can't use password-based encryption, at least generate a new key per app installation. At least then, if one user's device is stolen and compromised, you know, all the rest of the devices and all the rest of the installations aren't also compromised. The Android on the developer site has a good example of just, you know, how to correctly generate a key using, you know, secure random and things like that. Moving on to sort of verifying your kind of app, I just thought I'd show you one recipe that I kind of quite like for verifying that your app hasn't been Trojanized or hasn't been you know, hijacked. I kind of mentioned earlier about the developer certificate. You know, it breaks if you decompile and sort of mess with the code. That's the whole point of signature. It's making sure that the files are the same. And the other thing, the point to make is that your signature stays the same for an app. So if you release an app today, it's going to stay the same. It's going to be my developer certificate for the life of that app. And so what we can do is, we know this at build time, so we can extract that very easily using the key tool, which is just like a tool as part of the JDK. And you know, you list that, you get the output, and you can just copy and paste that the signature, the SHA-1 of it, into a string. And then at runtime, you can get the signature from the package manager. You know, hash the signature so they're in the same format. Then just do a simple string compare, and that is just you know, a quick and easy way of doing you know, verifying the app hasn't been changed. Of course, probably some of you are thinking, well, if they can change the app, surely they can just remove this check. True, that's potential, and so that's why we look in a couple of slides' time how we can use obfuscation to make that a lot harder to do. The other thing we can do is try and look at the integrity of the device we're running on. So, as I kind of mentioned early on, that the Google Safety Net, there's this test method that's part of the Google Play services that you can run. And officially, I've written a helper library for it to sort of make it easier and do some on-device validation. And there's an app in the Play Store that you can go and run on your device and see if it goes green or red. Hopefully it'll be green. But what officially it runs, it tests the device for CTS compatibility, and CTS is like stands for the Compatibility Test Suite, and it's kind of part of what all Android devices, all versions of Android have to sort of pass to prove that, you know, apps will run on it, and you know, it will be sort of standard hardware. So, you know, the Amazon Kindle, Fire OS all passes CTS, and that's, you know, CyanogenMod all passes CTS tests. However, what we found was that actually that will come back false if it's a rooted device, or if you're running any kind of root tools, or if you've got any active exploits on the device. So it's quite a cool way. It's quite a good way, sorry, of detecting root and detecting you know, if the device has been compromised. Talking of kind of root checks, myself and a colleague at Interhand, Matt Rawlings, we wrote a library called RootBeer, which was kind of like a collection of Java and sort of native-based root checks. Sort of collected that all, you know, from Stack Overflow and various articles, plus a few of our own checks, into sort of one place so you can run that to sort of verify if it's rooted. I think the thing to remember about when you're checking device integrity is that if it's a rooted device, ultimately a root user is the equivalent of God on the device, so they can always trick any on-device things. And that's why Google, the Android security team, really recommend with SafetyNet, the SafetyNet helper, is to use the server-side component to sort of help with that validation. And I'm working on creating a sample app to that at the moment. The idea there is the app wouldn't necessarily know it's running on a compromised device, but your server would, and then you can stop communicating with that installation of the app. So the sort of last part I want to talk about was sort of binary protection, and you know, really we're talking code obfuscation. And for those unfamiliar with obfuscation, it's basically just turning, you know, easy to read code and easy to decompile code into you know, harder to understand stuff, kind of like we have in the background here. But you know, what I should say about this, it's security through obscurity. It's not like it's making it harder, but it's not like encrypting it or anything. It's just making it harder to read. So Proguard is, for those familiar with Android, hopefully you'll be familiar with Proguard. It's a Java obfuscator. It's part of the SDK. It's free. And the configuration for this is already set up, and enabling it is literally just adding one line to your Gradle file or to your project. And yeah, it's very easy to use. One of the things, the sort of gotchas or things to remember when you're obfuscating your code is that if you get crashes, the stack traces from any kind of application errors and crashes you get are also going to be obfuscated as well. And that can be a pain when you're trying to work out what the hell's gone on. And so, to give you examples, class A and method B has crashed, and you have not. That's all you've got to go on. Is ludicrously difficult. So, fortunately, there's a tool called Retrace, which is part of the kind of Proguard bundle, and you take your crash, in a stack trace in a text file, the Retrace tool, and then a mappings file, which is one of the outputs from Proguard. And that, together, spits out your translated crash, so you can understand it. That used to be a bit of a pain to do, and it slowed down bug fixing. Services such as Crashlytics, Criticism, Hockey App all support deobfuscating those stack traces, which is pretty good. Crashlytics I'm a massive fan of, and that does it automatically, whereas the other ones you have to go and press a button and get it to join like a queue. Whereas Crashlytics does it automatically, and it's free. If you want to kind of go pro, I totally recommend you do, because Proguard will give you a certain level. Tools like DexGuard, other options like from Meteophoric or Arcsan, more costly, but will kind of increase the difficulty for attackers. And so this is designed for Android specifically and protection. Rather than just optimization. It's got a load of security utils, and some of the things we talked about in this talk, actually, they've done it for you, and they've got it you can just use, which is pretty cool. And my favorite feature is that there's a string encryption feature where you can, this is great for API keys that you have in your classes or files, that you can just note which, either the actual literal or just the classes they're in, and get that encrypted. And obviously the key is stored somewhere in the APK, because if it wasn't, then when your app was running at runtime, it wouldn't be able to sort of pass that API key to your web service or whatever. But it's just a nice way of hiding that information and making it harder to find. And the other thing is API hiding, which is a way of it converts your normal, nice to understand code into Java reflection-based calls, which are a lot more difficult to understand when you decompile. Just quickly on testing, because it's really essential to see the other side of the coin, to try and hack some of your own apps and see what the people can see, and also verify that your code obfuscation and all that stuff has worked. So you can use this AndroGuard, APK tool, Dexterjar. There's loads of tools, but I just wanted to shout out 2 libraries just quickly. This has been recently open sourced by LinkedIn. And it will run through your app, and you can and it will kind of generate HTML report with your weaknesses and exploits. Really cool. Droza, again, similar things. Been around for a lot longer, but yeah, you can integrate this into your CI and run that as part of your development process. I put some links in for everyone for reference, because there's way too much to cover in the time, and so. Hopefully in that first kind of jungle section, we kind of talked, I was able to articulate about the ecosystem and the diversity, and the risks and some of the kind of potential threats in the jungle. And then, the last section, we covered some things to sort of tool up and really harden your Android apps. So with that, thanks very much for listening. Cheers. Cool. If anyone's got any questions, please shout.
With regards to the obfuscation of the code, if you were running an open source project, do you mean the binary needs to be obfuscated, or the source as well needs to be obfuscated?
Well, yeah, the binary. It's binary protection. Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're hosting this source, because then that would allow someone else to sort of like audit your.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the point is you're protecting it. So, yeah, there's almost no point in obfuscating it if it's an open source library, because they can go and look at how it's working, and the whole point of when you're decompiling the code is so you can look at how it's working to work out where the secrets are. So,
It's the source that you're trying to hide rather
yeah,
than like the binary is not a sort of runtime sort of thing.
yeah, yeah. The idea when you're attacking an app is you do the static analysis to give you clues, so when you run it dynamically that you can go and find out where the API key has been used, or the secret has been decrypted or whatever, or as we showed here, where your certificate check has been in place. So by obfuscating it makes that more difficult. So yeah, if you've got an open source library, yeah, that's it's already there for your attackers effectively. So
Would you say that an open source library is therefore, in your opinion, that much more mildly more insecure?
Well, it's from the point of static analysis, yes, but that's just part of the puzzle, isn't it? It's more secure from the fact, in theory, because it's got more eyes on. In theory, not that helped with all those OpenSSL issues, but yeah, that's I guess. Hopefully, I made the point there. Yeah, the point is of obfuscation is to hide the code that you've written and make it difficult to understand. And if it's open source, then it's almost pointless to do that. But that's not to say you shouldn't obfuscate open source libraries, because it all adds to the kind of it makes it more difficult, for attackers. So if you're using open source libraries, often they're excluded from obfuscation, but why not add them into the mix, and reduces your APK file size as well. So yeah.
You have to figure out which open source library you're using, right? So if it's obfuscated, then
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cool. I hope that's kind of answered your question.
Yeah.
Was there any other questions?
Yeah, so I mean, that's ultimately the point you made, the correct point, that it's really only encryption is truly secure, and it's only secure as the key that you use.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of two questions. The first is, you recommend using it based on the password, clearly, because that you can dynamically request that and then destroy it when you've finished with it. From a usability point of view, that's kind of potentially problematic. It's a bit of a barrier to the user. They're going to have to, I think, firstly, they're going to have to believe there's something worth encrypting and storing securely in your app.
Yep.
So I guess the question is there any kind of halfway house?
Well,
one time requesting that password. It'll never be perfect.
No, and I guess I probably should have started off with there is no perfect security. The other alternative you could look at is using things like the Android key store. So that uses a device pin to do stuff, but again, I find the reason why I didn't talk about that in this presentation is because I found that's just not a requirement apps can make unless you've got like an enterprise app. It's really difficult to sort of enforce that type of thing. So yeah, the compromise is security. So you could generate a key and then have it encrypted and make them enter it once and store it in memory and keep that until they hit log out. But yeah.
So I guess the second question is how secure is the memory? I don't know how secure the memory model is in Android.
So if you've got a rooted device, so if
that's the way you'd want to check if you're rooted.
Yeah.
It's still clear into it.
Yeah, cool. Time's up, but yeah. If anyone's got any more questions, please come give me a shout. I'm around all day. So cool. Thanks very much.